Welcome to Reclaim Democracy. On today's show, we're going to be trying to shed some light on a very little-known subject, depleted uranium. Today, our guest is Lorraine Moret, and hopefully she'll help us out with this. She is an independent scientist working on radiation and public health issues with communities around the world. Lauren, maybe you could spend a couple of minutes and just give the audience a little introduction into yourself and your background.
I'm a geoscientist, which means I study the Earth and Earth processes, and I've worked at 2 nuclear weapons laboratories in California. The Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory in Berkeley, California, where the A-bomb project was developed during World War II, and at Livermore Nuclear Weapons Laboratory, which is one of the 2 premier nuclear weapons laboratories in the U.S. I'm also an environmental commissioner in the city of Berkeley.
Okay. Let's start off with the basics. I'm sure that not many people out there really understand what depleted uranium is. So just give us a bit of a background on what depleted uranium is, where it comes from and whatnot.
Well, depleted uranium is a way to take your radioactive trash and maximize the profits. Okay. And so I just like to read something from Smedley Butler, which sort of is the underlying theme for all of this, war and militarism and the devastation of war. He was a major general in the Marine Corps in World War I. Mm-hmm. War is a racket. War is a racket. It always has been. It is possibly the oldest, easily the most profitable, and surely the most vicious. It is the only one international in scope. It is the only one in which the profits are reckoned in dollars and the losses in lives. A racket is best described, I believe, as something that is not what it seems to the majority of people. Only a small inside group knows what it is about. It is conducted for the benefit of the very few at the expense of the very many. Out of a war, a few people make huge fortunes, and that is exactly what is happening now. It is not a partisan issue. This is an issue that concerns all living things, all human beings. It doesn't care what religion you belong to, what level of economic well-being you have, and it doesn't care where you live. It's an indiscriminate killer, inhumane mutilator, and cause of many diseases.
Okay.
So, depleted uranium basically is the trash from the nuclear weapons program. Mm-hmm. This is the fallout map of nuclear weapons testing in the U.S. Every person living in the U.S. was contaminated internally, and it's the trash from the nuclear power project. Now, these are both huge.
When you say trash, I'd like to just mention that's a byproduct of the nuclear power industry, the corporations that produce energy. Okay.
That's right. It's left over from the uranium they extract from natural uranium mined around the world, and they make nuclear fuel out of it. Mm-hmm. And sometimes they also take the nuclear trash from the spent fuel and dump that into the depleted uranium as well.
Okay. In the past, when depleted uranium was first, let's say, a discovery and an issue, how was it dealt with? I mean, what was the safe way to deal with it, and where did that lead us to?
Well, the sort of the nuclear show got on the road in World War II, and that was with the A-bomb project, which was called the Manhattan Project. This is a declassified memo from 1943, October 30th, and it was to General Leslie Groves, who was in charge of the A-bomb project. This document is the blueprint for depleted uranium, and they describe it as a very effective terrain contaminant, a very effective biological weapon, and a impossible to develop any protective clothing or gas masks that will prevent contamination. And it was developed under the Manhattan Project as a radioactive poison gas weapon to be delivered from the air, land vehicles, and on the battlefield. In other words, it's the blueprint for dirty bombs, dirty missiles, and dirty bullets.
So what do you think they thought about this new thing that they had?
Well, they were developing the atomic bombs, and of course they didn't know whether they would work or not in 1943. And so they said, let's take the radioactive trash from this project and make these dirty bombs, dirty missiles, and dirty bullets. But they also realized what a horrific weapon this was, as well as chemical weapons like Agent Orange and biological weapons. And because they were so horrific, the United States government decided not to develop them and use them in World War II.
Okay.
However, when the oil wars started and petroleum reserves were targeted for control by different countries around the world, we took them off the shelf. And Agent Orange was the first chemical war for oil, and since 1991, we've had 4 nuclear wars using depleted uranium for oil.
How about let's kind of draw a little bit of correlation for the audience. How about talk about the ties between the energy production facilities? Talk about the ties between government, the ties with the banking industry, the ties with the military complex.
The contractors for DOE, 95% of the Department of Energy is contractors. It's a way to pump huge amounts of money into the private sector. So Bechtel, Science Applications International Corporation, or we call it SAIC, Kaiser, TRW, there are many, many more. These are all contractors at the nuclear weapons laboratories and the Department of Energy facilities. And we pump billions of dollars into them at Hanford, at the Nevada test site, at Los Alamos and Livermore and Oak Ridge nuclear weapons laboratories. This is the main way to feed the corporations in the United States by the government.
Okay. Earlier on you were speaking about banks' investment in this as well. Maybe you could touch back to that a little bit.
Yes, what I uncovered, I began attending UC Regents, University of California Regents meetings to learn about what was happening with the management contract for the nuclear weapons laboratories. And what I discovered is corporations were well represented on the Board of Regents, as they are at many other universities. There are tremendous amounts of Department of Defense funding going into universities. And a great website to understand that is Fiat Pax. Now, the trash from the nuclear weapons program was tested as weapons systems beginning in about the late 1960s. This all correlates with oil.
It's good to know the historical context of, you know, this isn't something new.
This is not
You're
something
saying
new.
it's actually been a very well understood and studied.
Yes. And some of the early manufacturers, for instance, it was the Hughes Corporation that developed the the Phalanx weapon system for the Navy. This was in about 1975. And this was tested on the USS Bigelow out of Hunters Point Naval Shipyard in San Francisco. It was so successful they immediately sold it to all branches of the U.S. military and about 12 countries and departments of military in the U.S.
Well, you talk about the success of this particular thing. How is depleted uranium used in warfare? I mean, you know, speak of its history of being used. Right up to the present.
Yes, it was first used on the battlefield in the Yom Kippur War in 1973. The U.S. government gave it to Israel. Israel used it under U.S. government supervision in the 5-day war. It wiped out the Arab tanks, and that's when they immediately went into development, production, and testing. We have 37 states now contaminated with depleted uranium from manufacturing, testing, deployment, storage, development, and sales. So The U.S. is very contaminated already. The Jefferson Proving Ground is so contaminated with DU and other radiation.
Where is the Jefferson Proving Ground?
I think it's in Indiana.
Indiana?
It's
Okay.
a national sacrifice zone.
And just to mention, downwind of there
Right.
would be...
Yes, and the communities downwind from all of these testing facilities are, they are characteristically having a lot of problems with radiation-related illnesses.
Has there been any testing that kind of correlates to, okay, if you're downwind of one of these testing sites where DU might have been released, is it shown up in certain areas, be it IQ scores
Sure.
or health? Or
Sure. The Fallon Naval Air Station, 20 miles east of Reno, Nevada, they have the fastest growing leukemia cluster in the United States. And what I discovered was that the Navy had been testing depleted uranium weapon systems for the Air Force for decades on the bombing and gunnery ranges that are around Fallon, and they're within 20 miles. But who is making the money on this? Where do the corporations fit into this? And how are they doing this? When I began going to UC Regents meetings, I discovered that the University of California had $30 million invested in one of the two main depleted uranium manufacturers in the U.S. The two main ones are Alliant Industries and Defense Industries.
okay, are these completely private corporations?
These are private corporations.
Not functioning in the public interest, functioning for the benefit of...
And then I discovered the California Government Workers Pension Fund, which is the biggest one in the United States, owns 5.5% of the Carlyle Group, which is the iron triangle. The Carlyle Group is exactly what President Eisenhower warned us against, the iron triangle.
Okay, let's get back to where else has depleted, let's bring it more up to the present in the use of depleted uranium in warfare.
Okay.
Obviously, you know, Gulf War.
Okay, I just wanted to mention that I also learned that CalPERS, the California Pension Fund, has an option to buy another 5% of the Carlyle Group, and the Carlyle Group is also investing pension funds for Canadian government workers. This is global.
Yep.
So where are they using this? In 1991, the U.S. military used depleted uranium weapons on the battlefield for the first time in Iraq. They used at least, we know, 340 tons. That's only the bullets. That does not include the dirty bombs and the dirty missiles. In Afghanistan, in 1000, they used at least 1,000 tons. In Yugoslavia in 1995 and 1998, they grid bombed and carpet bombed. They actually did, NATO forces did 35,000 bombing runs in 1998 in Yugoslavia. And in the 2003 war, we used at least 2,400 tons in Iraq.
This is an ugly way to phrase this, but who benefits from all this bombing? You know,
well,
you can look at the standard issues of warfare, but who financially benefits?
Well, let's ask, why are we bombing?
Yeah, okay, there we go.
Why are we bombing? Why are we bombing is all in this book. This is called The Grand Chessboard. It's by Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was national security leader under a number of presidents. And basically, this book outlines our U.S. foreign policy, and it's exactly the foreign policy we're carrying out now, and we will be carrying out for the next 100 years. We're headed for eternal, unending war, and the reason is that we have an oil-based economy, and the oil we need is in other countries and on other continents. This is the roadmap on how to get control of those resources.
Okay.
So by using DU as a biological weapon in countries that have oil resources we want to control, we can destroy the civilian population and the resistance to our imperialistic goals in their countries.
Let's talk for a minute about the effects that depleted uranium has on, you know, on the military, it has on our veterans, has on people in Iraq.
In fact, it has on people around the world because it's global radioactive pollution in the air that we breathe. And depleted uranium is a poison gas radioactive weapon. What is so deadly about it and effective, and they mention that in the 1943 memo, they knew everything then that they know now, that they're covering up, and that is that it burns at very high temperatures. The bombs and missiles hit the ground with tremendous kinetic energy, which is converted to heat, and it completely vaporizes 100% of the DU warhead. In bullets and larger caliber shells, it's on fire as it travels through the air. There's nothing but a naked uranium rod that flies through the air. The rest of the bullet flies off. And when you're watching mainstream media pictures of, for instance, Fallujah or Iraq or wherever, you can tell it's a uranium weapon because there are tiny sparks and splatters that are all on fire that shower out from an impact, whether it's a missile or bullets or whatever.
So if I'm out there breathing in, absorbing in, you know,
Yes.
how does it get in your system?
And this radioactive gas dissipates in the air. It's carried in the winds. It's remobilized over and over again in these hot, arid, windy regions, and it's impossible to avoid exposure.
So you're saying that no matter what precautions you might supply to the military, it's going to be absorbing the system. There are no filters small enough to protect yourself?
No, it goes through all air filters because these tiny particles in the body do the same thing. They go past all the body's defenses. It's a systemic poison. And what these tiny nanoparticles deliver, they're smaller than a virus, they're smaller than bacteria. 1/10 of a micron, which is the definition of a nanoparticle and smaller, is 100 times smaller than a blood cell. So these are carried, they're inhaled into the lungs, 70% go into the bloodstream. They're carried all over the body, through the cell membrane, into the DNA, and they just really literally trash any living thing that is exposed to them. They stay in the body permanently because they're insoluble and the body can't excrete them. In a study of nanoparticles by Dr. Oberdorster at Rochester University, he exposed mice to particles of Teflon, a little bit larger than nanoparticles. Nothing happened.
Okay.
He exposed mice to nano-sized particles of Teflon, and almost all of them were dead in 4 hours.
So you're saying, or his study points out, that a lot of that is all based on the size of the particle.
The
and
size
depleted uranium.
the size of the particle is almost more important than what the particle is made of.
Okay. But what about what these particles are made about? I mean, does that have an effect as well? The fact that they're depleted uranium.
Yes, what they're doing is delivering a pharmaceutical dose of chemical toxicity from the heavy metal, of radiation from the energy from the nucleus, and then the very tiny particles have a completely separate effect, a particulate effect. And this is what makes exposed soldiers sick within 24 to 48 hours when they're exposed on the battlefield. And soldiers came back incontinent in adult diapers after 1 week on the battlefield in Gulf War I.
Okay, so that's what happened to the soldiers there. And I
Yes.
guess, of course, that can be said for
Right.
that's what's happening
That's
to the people that live in these countries.
That's
What
right.
about when they come home?
Now the soldiers come home and they bring the depleted uranium home in their bodies and in their semen. They are very, very ill. They internally contaminate their wives and their partners, and they become ill with depleted uranium poisoning. And of course, the babies that are born after the exposure, these soldiers had normal babies before they went to war. They came back, and in a group of 251 veterans in Mississippi, 67% of the babies were deemed to have severe birth defects by the Veterans Administration.
Okay. I'm a little taken back by that, sorry.
Actually, that is a great photo essay on in Life magazine. It's called "The Tiny Victims of Desert Storm," and anyone listening can go to the internet and see this wonderful and very, very sad photo essay of what happened to these poor soldiers and to the children they fathered when they came back.
What kind of percentage of soldiers coming back are showing effects that can be attributed to depleted uranium?
Well, in each war, the contamination levels are higher in, for instance, Iraq, and as they continue bombing and using these horrific weapons, the whole environment is just much more contaminated. What we do know, that's a difficult question to answer, but what we do know is that an interview by the American Free Press and my friend, the journalist Christopher Bolin, last August, he was interviewing Terry Jemison in the Department of Veterans Affairs, and Mr. Jemison said in August of 2004 that there are now 539,479 Gulf-era soldiers from the last 14-year period on medical disability. That's not what the Pentagon is saying. And when I have given that number to, for instance, Al Jazeera or other journalists, the Pentagon put tremendous pressure on those media outlets to reduce the official number of soldiers on medical disability. And in that same period, how many soldiers do you think were injured on that same 14-year period?
How many?
7,035. So how do we get 500,000 soldiers on medical disability today when only 7,000 were injured on the battlefield? This is an environmental exposure. It's happening to the civilians in these countries. The severity of birth defects in Iraq are so bad now that over 10 babies a day are born with very, very severe birth defects. Some of them don't even have heads or legs or arms. They're pieces of flesh.
Okay.
This is a nuclear nightmare that will just get worse and worse over time.
We've got about 5 minutes left.
Yes.
I want to give you a fair amount of time,
Yes.
but actually maybe 6 minutes left.
Okay.
Could you just, you mentioned Al Jazeera, you mentioned other media
Right.
outlets. You know, I think of the U.S. as, okay, we've got the mainstream media, and obviously this subject is not known at all if you just pay attention to mainstream media. What's your take on that?
Well, let's look at why this...
The corporate media.
Yes, let's talk about why this is not getting to the American public and why this is continuing. First of all, the corporate media, I made a list recently of members of the corporate media who are members of the Trilateral Commission or the Council on Foreign Relations. These are both started and controlled by David Rockefeller, who's a big oil corporation. We are seeing recycled Nazis now, like the Rockefellers, like other members of, such as the Bush family, who sold 50% of the raw materials to the Nazi war machine in World War II. We're just seeing corporatism recycled.
This is all history that the typical person doesn't see.
Okay.
And I got to mention that for those of you that question any of this, do your own research. Go out
Yes,
there.
I don't want anyone to believe me. I want you to say, what is she talking about? I want to know more. And then you own that information. You're not quoting me, and people aren't going to attack you because you can say, I read this myself. I investigated, and I know this. Never in the history of the United States have Americans known more about what their government is secretly doing and what the CIA is secretly doing. The CIA is corporations.
It's nice to install critical thinking in the viewers out there. We've got about 4.5 minutes. Why don't you just run with this for a little while?
So what I want to say is that our pension funds and government pension funds in other countries are being hijacked, and they will be looted eventually by these corporations and weapons manufacturers. We already had Enron. CalPERS, the California State Pension Fund, is getting ready. They're getting set up to be looted and privatized. Weapons manufacturers are banks, are invested in them. We have successfully pressured 2 banks in Belgium now to divest from depleted uranium weapons manufacturers. This is beginning to tip away from the total unaccountability of the Pentagon and the Department of Defense.
This area, I love that you're talking about
Yes.
this. This area is the important part of this show where you can definitely say, okay, well, we've heard all this bad stuff.
That's
You know,
right.
give us
That's
what's
right.
going on that we can actually affect change.
That's
be
right.
be democratic. Actually,
Now, one of the banks in Belgium is the 11th largest bank in the world. So this is not a small, insignificant bank. This is a trend that we can encourage banks in other countries to follow. The European Parliament is holding a depleted uranium conference in June 23rd to 26th, to abolish depleted uranium weapons in NATO countries. That means all of Europe. That's a huge victory.
you know, we didn't mention the legal status of this. Could you hit that real quick
Oh,
too? Sorry
yes.
for that.
The legal status is that depleted uranium weapons are illegal under the 4 tests of legality in weapons under international law. Depleted uranium weapons are illegal under international treaties, international agreements. They violate U.S. federal code. They meet the weapon of mass destruction definition of the U.S. government, and they violate U.S. military law.
Okay, so we've definitely called it for what it
Yes.
is. Any other success stories that you can kind of
Yes.
say where we're
Now-
going with this? What are you doing with this? How are you
Right.
affecting change?
The very, very most important thing that is
Got about 1
happening
minute.
is the Connecticut legislature has a bill in process which requires the state of Connecticut to independently test returning soldiers from Afghanistan and Iraq and the veterans. This is the most important thing that can happen. We need to get states, municipalities, and counties and parishes to begin to take control of the depleted uranium issue. These soldiers are coming back ill. The VA will not treat them. They have pre-existing conditions. They can't get health insurance. So it's going to be on the taxpayers' backs to take care of these poor soldiers and their families. This is a nuclear nightmare. This is an economic nightmare, and we must do something about it. And it will be our collective action that makes the difference. Here, why don't you just read what President Roosevelt said
Okay.
about the Iron Triangle.
The Iron Triangle. Big business, politics under one roof. The liberty of democracy is not safe if the people tolerate growth of private power. I shouldn't be smiling when I read this. To a point where it becomes stronger than their democratic state itself. That is, in essence, is fascism. Ownership of government by an individual, by a group, or a controlling private power.
And that is the Carlyle Group.
Wow. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Take this information home and utilize it. Hopefully do a little bit of research and verify your own facts.
And take our democracy back.
Thanks.
We got politicians running races on corporate cash. Now don't tell me they don't turn around and kiss them people's ass. You may call me old-fashioned, that don't fit my picture of a true democracy. It feels like I am living in the wasteland.